Chag Sameach, Moadim L'Simcha. I hope you all enjoyed your Seders. It's nice to see everyone. We also have some nice weather here in Detroit. Finally, I think the end of winter. Winter's that season when it actually gets very cold and there's snow. I don't know if you're familiar in California, but winter's finally ending here. We got some nice spring weather ahead. So it's good to see everyone. And yeah, incidentally, if you go to Barney Greengrass, which is on the Upper West Side, I think it's 89th in Amsterdam, you're going to, if you don't want to eat the sturgeon, if you're not a sturgeon eater, you're going to want to try the lox and bagel, lox omelet. It's a life-altering experience. You know, they put everything they got in the food, not so much in the decor, but it doesn't matter because it's Barney Greengrass. So our topic for today, well, first let me say a word about the title. I'm sorry I ate your fish. This is a reference to a movie that came out about 20 or 30 years ago called A Fish Called Wanda, an Academy Award-winning movie, not for Best Picture, for Best Supporting Actor. But if you know that movie, then you'll recognize that phrase. But really, what we're going to talk about today is a dispute more broadly over the question of kashrut, but more specifically over whether a particular fish called the sturgeon is kosher or not. Now, I was thinking that in many ways, it's very apt to talk about this on Pesach, because Pesach is a holiday, among other things, where kashrut, kosher for Passover, is a very serious consideration. In general, the laws and restrictions of kashrut on Pesach are more strict, are more severe than the rest of the year. And lately, there's been I don't know if I would call it a debate or a dispute, but there's been growing a discussion among Ashkenazic Jews as to whether or not it's permissible to eat kitniot, legumes. And I will come back to that because I think there's a difference between whether or not Ashkenazic Jews eat kitniot and this debate over the sturgeon. So let me tell you the short version of the story, and then I'll tell you the longer version of the story. The short version of the story is that at the turn of the 19th century, around the year 1800, in southeastern Europe, really in the border of Hungary and Romania, you can look at the map if you have the map in front of you. A couple of rabbis disagreed over whether or not sturgeon was permissible, and it actually started as a localized dispute, a little fish fight over whether a particular food is kosher, but it expanded and exploded into a controversy that nearly divided the Jews of Hungary. They almost divided over the question of whether sturgeon was kosher. That's the short version of the story. The long version of the story is the context is important here, both in terms of where it happened and when it happened. So let me explain where and when, both in specific terms and then in more general terms. So the where it happened, if you have the map in front of you, it happened in a part of Europe called Transylvania. Yes, that's a real part of Europe. That's where Dracula actually lived. Transylvania is a border province between Hungary and Romania. So today, Transylvania is the westernmost part of Romania. Until 1918, for several centuries, it had been the easternmost part of Hungary. Hungarians and Romanians have been fighting over Transylvania for some time. And now, it's not just a border province between these two countries. It's also situated more broadly on the cusp of the Ashkenazic and the Sephardic world. Long story short, the part of Romania known as Wallachia, it was a part of Romania where there were a lot of Sephardic Jews, and still are a lot of Sephardic Jews, many who came long story short, when Romania was part of the Ottoman Empire and Jews came from there. So it has Sephardic Jews. And further west, on the Hungarian side, there are lots of Ashkenazic Jews. And our story begins in the city of, today it's called Timișoara in Romania, but until 1918, or it's also for Hungarians, it's called Temesvar. This was a Jewish community that had both Ashkenazic and Sephardic Jews. So that's the where. It's on the cusp of the Ashkenazic and Sephardic Jew world, a place where different customs, including the custom of whether or not sturgeon is kosher, coexisted within the same community. The when is also important. Specifically, this is a controversy that didn't last very long. Started in 1797 and was more or less done by 1803. But more broadly, the when is important because the turn of the 19th century in the Ashkenazic world, this is the cusp of two very different periods in the history of Ashkenazic Judaism. Our story takes place at the cusp of a long period of time where there were no denominations in Judaism, and it ends at it's the beginning of a period where we have denominations. So let me pause for a moment and explain that to make sure that's clear. When I say denominations in Judaism, I mean Orthodox, Conservative, Reform, Reconstructionist. Those are all 19th or 20th century inventions. If we were to travel back in time, let's say 220 years, back to 1800 or a little before, there was no such thing as Reform Judaism. Conservative and Reconstructionists came later, but there was also no such thing as Orthodox Judaism. Now, that's a little bit more counterintuitive. Orthodox Judaism as a mentality started as a response, most dramatically as a response to Reform Judaism. The two, in a sense, were born together. But as we'll see today, in some ways, the mentality of Orthodox Judaism, which I will explain, started in the aftermath of this Sturgeon controversy. So you might be asking, okay, I understand how there's no Reform Judaism, but if there's no Orthodox Judaism, what was there? And the answer simply is there was Judaism. There were no denominations or labels. There was one thing called Judaism. There was one basket of beliefs and practices and symbols and institutions. And some Jews were more observant and some Jews were less observant, and some Jews were pious and some Jews were heretics or indifferent. But all Jews, and I mean all Jews pretty much in the world, define themselves in terms of this same basket, so to speak, called Judaism, Yiddishkeit, Judentum, whatever word you want to choose for it. There was just Judaism. Now, I want to make clear what this Judaism consisted of. This pre-denominational Judaism really consisted of, it had four essential features. Now, I'm going to list them and explain them to you because these four essential features are going to be crucial in understanding the debate and the conflict over the Sturgeon. So here are the four characteristics of this pre-denominational Judaism. Number one, this Judaism, excuse me, just a little bit getting over a cold. First, this pre-denominational Judaism was dynamic, not static. Change and innovation were inherent parts of Judaism. And moreover, there were particular halachic rules which guided rabbinic scholars in how they could interpret and make changes in Judaism. You know, a rabbi who teaches at the Jewish Theological Seminary named Joe Roth, he characterized this Judaism. The metaphor he used was the chessboard, which some of you may have heard. He compared Judaism to the pieces on a chessboard, where during the course of a game of chess, a chess match, the pieces can move around as long as you follow the particular rules of the game, which are the rules of halachic interpretation. And in any given moment, the constellation of the chessboard will look different. The pieces will be in different places. This was Judaism. It was dynamic, not static. That's first. Secondly, in this pre-denominational Judaism, there was a healthy balance between uniformity and diversity of practice. So what do I mean by uniformity? Apart from the big ticket items, believing in God, the calendar, but also the synagogue service had for centuries been more or less uniform, to the point where a Jew from anywhere in the world could walk into a synagogue anywhere else in the world and not only follow the service, maybe even lead, but certainly feel that he or she had fulfilled the obligation and had had the experience of communal prayer. The Torah reading. Jews around the world have for centuries read the same thing from the Torah every day. We all have a Seder on the same night. And there are things that are common to all these Seders. Have you ever been to a Seder where at the end, L'Shana Haba'ah B'Yerushalayim, next year in Jerusalem, was not the culmination of the Seder, even before the songs at the end? That's uniformity. But there also was a measure of diversity. Not everything was exactly the same. So within the prayer service, for example, there are different customs, standing and sitting at different times. There are minor variations in the prayer service. There are minor variations in the liturgy. There are other practices. I'll give you a Pesach example of diversity of practice, the aforementioned kitniot. For the last 700 years, most Ashkenazic Jews have refrained from eating kitniot. Most non-Ashkenazic Jews eat kitnia, legumes on Passover. And this difference has been going on for centuries, largely without incident, because this sort of diversity of practice was baked into the fabric of this pre-denominational Judaism, uniformity and diversity. Now, the mechanism for diversity and the mechanism for making innovations has been described by one 20th century historian. The word he used to describe it is mimetic. In other words, deciding, that which is permitted and that which is forbidden to do in Judaism, in observing the laws of Judaism, is not only determined by the ruling of a rabbi or a Beit Din or a law code, but mimetic means you follow your own family custom or your own communal custom, and those can vary from place to place. So in a kosher home, the big ticket items are the same. Pork is treif no matter where you go. But on a level of detail, I would venture to say that no two Jewish families keep kosher exactly the same way. Even no two Chabad families keep kosher in exactly the same way. There are minor variations. And this mimetic approach means you follow that which your family does. I'll give you a personal example of a mimetic just to illustrate what I mean. My family, we lived in Waterville, Maine for a few years. Waterville, Maine is a small town with virtually no Jews. There are fewer than 100 Jews there. I think we might have been the only Jews there who kept kosher. I know we were the only Jews there who weren't intermarried. And so on Pesach, Pesach was challenging in Waterville, Maine, because in the supermarket in Waterville, Maine, as you can imagine, they only had two kosher for Pesach products, matzah and macaroons. So what we would normally do is we'd go to the Seders at my parents in Michigan, and we'd bring enough kosher for Pesach food back with us to last the week. But one year we underestimated and we kind of ran out. So we had to figure out what to do. Now, there are certain products that don't require to be hechsher, don't need to be certified, like fresh produce and eggs. So we were able to get that. But then there was the question of butter. And I couldn't remember if in my family we require butter to be marked kosher for Pesach in order to eat it. And here's the point. In my mimetic approach to being Judaism, to being Jewish, to observance, I didn't try to find the answer in a law code. I didn't try to find the answer in some kosher gram or something. I called my mom and I said, Mom, do we eat butter on Pesach without a hechsher? Now, whatever her answer would have been, yes, no, sometimes, whatever, that was the answer. End of story. That's mimetic Judaism. And that was Judaism for the vast majority of Jews who lived and observed this pre-denominational Judaism. So, dynamic, not static, a healthy balance of uniformity and diversity. In this pre-denominational Judaism, there was also a balance between stringency and leniency. Both stringent and lenient approaches were acceptable and authentic. Being more lenient or more strict, both were more acceptable. Now, that's different from today. In many Orthodox circles, stringent is considered to be automatically more authentic and more pious. That's only been true for the last couple of 100 years. And that will be a crucial element of this Sturgeon story. And finally, the fourth element of this pre-denominational Judaism was a preference for unity over divisiveness. Figure out how we can all observe Judaism with our differences, with our diversity, but still be part of one unified Jewish community. Sectarianism, seceding from the Jewish community, ostracizing one another was not an acceptable course of action, even though occasionally it did happen. Okay. Now, this pre-denominational Judaism, this is part of the background of the Sturgeon debate. Now, let me give you a little halachic background. Let me tell you a little bit about how in Judaism we determine whether or not fish is kosher. Now, I know most of you know the basic biblical standard. It's snapirim and kaskasot, fins and scales. In the multiple times in the Torah, the Torah is very clear that a fish or a sea creature that has fins and scales is kosher, and if it doesn't have fins and scales, it doesn't. Seems cut and dry, but one of the geniuses of our sages is they were able to think beyond the obvious cut and dry examples and to imagine the gray and the ambiguous and to try to address those as opposed to ignoring them. And They came up with two things. So first, if you look at your handout, look at text number 1 if you have your handout. Here's a statement in the Mishnah where the rabbis are going to elaborate on the biblical commandment or biblical standards of fish being kosher. And this is a tractate Nida. Kol sheyesh lo kaskeset, yesh lo snapir is the first part. Any fish that has scales is presumed to have fins. Fins is not the issue. If it has scales, it has fins. But there are fish that have fins but don't have scales. Scales is the issue, so we can leave fins aside. Now, in trying to determine those cases in which it was unclear whether or not fish have scales or not, like sturgeon, but also like swordfish, the rabbis created the following standard or the following litmus test. Now, I'll tell you the two terms they used. One was the Hebrew word or with an ayin, which means skin. The other is levush, which means like a vestment or like something outside the skin, like a clothing vestment. So the example of levush would be like feathers on a bird. And the test, whether or not the part of the animal was levush or is if you could remove something without tearing the skin, then it was levush, it was vestment. But if when you tried to remove something, the skin tore, it was part of the skin. And the standard they had for scales is in order for scales to be considered scales, I guess the term they would use is peelability. You had to be able to peel off the scales without tearing the skin. As long as you could peel off the scales without tearing the skin, it's a kosher fish. If you try to peel the scale and the skin tore, those are not scales, therefore the fish is not kosher. That was the Talmud's standard. Okay. Several centuries later, Nachmanides, the Ramban, about 800 years after the codification of the Talmud, he added a chumrah, he added a stringency. Because the Talmud had simply said peelability. Nachmanides, Ramban said peelability, but only peelability by hand. You have to be able to remove the scales by hand without tearing. If you need any kind of external something, like a knife, that doesn't count. Now, that subtle distinction between the Talmud and Maimonides is important because when it comes to halachic authority for later decisors, the Talmud, you can't disagree with the Talmud. The notion of the Talmud is sof hora'ah. It has final authority. It's difficult to disagree with the Talmud. But something post-Talmudic, while it can be used as a precedent to support your argument, you're allowed to disagree with it. With that in mind, that was the basic standard. Peelability by, in any way, according to the Talmud, peelability by hand, according to Nachmanides. Now, for many, many years, that simply was sort of the end of the story. But the end of the 18th century, in the 1780s, we have the following incident. In the city of Temeshvar, which is today Timisoara, this Jewish community where you have Jews with different practices about eating the sturgeon. Some thought it was unkosher. They had that custom. That was the standard Ashkenazic custom since sometime in the 1300s, actually even before. And there were some who not only ate it, but they insisted on eating it as part of certain festive meals, like the meal to break Yom Kippur. So you have two very different attitudes towards sturgeon. We can't eat it. We must eat it. And so they went to the rabbi, this very nice rabbi, whose name was Tzvi Hirsch of Temeshvar. And they said, Rabbi, we have this disagreement over sturgeon, but we want to be able to figure out what to do. We all want to be able to eat together. Is sturgeon kosher or not? And this rabbi just wasn't equipped to ask. So he referred the question to one of the leading rabbinic scholars of the age, and this was Rabbi Ezekiel Landau of Prague, who is known also by his rabbinic epithet, the Noda B'Yehuda, who was probably top 5 of that generation, maybe even top 10 of all time. He was a big time. And Prague in those days, this was like an Ivy League pulpit. If you were the rabbi of Prague, you really were the top of the mountain. So the Noda B'Yehuda, Landau wasn't sure, so he said, basically, send me this fish so I can take a look, so I can examine to him. And so they sent him a fish. What it must have smelled like when it got there, I have no idea. I don't want to know. Anyway, he looks at the fish, he examines the fish, and he tries to remove the scales by hand. He can't without tearing the skin. but then he soaks the fish in lye, and then after a couple of hours, and then using a knife, he's able to remove the scales without tearing the skin. So let's review here. According to the standard of the Talmud, peelability in any way, the fish is kosher. But according to the stringency added by Nachmanides, because Landau had to use a knife and lye, L-Y-E, the fish was not kosher. Now, I would say that was the basis of Landau's ruling. But before I read you his ruling on the sturgeon, let me read you another ruling, just so you can see that he is situated in this Judaism, which is okay with both leniency and stringency. Look at text number 2. This is not about sturgeon. This is another case that had come before Landau about whether or not it's permissible to ride in a carriage, a horse-drawn carriage, inside the eruv. In other words, in the Jewish community as opposed to intercity. And he got this request from the Jews of Debrecen, which is part of Moravia. This is text number 2. And here's Landau's response. Now remember, this is the question of riding in a carriage on Shabbat. Quote, if Debrecen is surrounded by a wall and has an eruv, such that there is no prohibition on carrying anywhere in town, it is permissible to ride in a post-chaise. That's the kind of carriage. That's the kind of carriage it was. You Google it; it's very fancy. There, even when there is no pressing need. He's not saying you can do it if it's a life and death situation. Anytime you want, you can ride that post-chaise. And even though outside the city is forbidden, even when there's a pressing need, still within the eruv it is permissible, even on Shabbat. It's okay to ride the post-chaise. This is a lenient ruling. Okay? With that in mind, he's going to apply the same attitude, although not necessarily the same conclusion, with the sturgeon. So look at text number 3. Here is his ruling about the sturgeon after he examined it. Quote, and there is no reason to say that immersion in fortified water, meaning lye, caused the scales to be peelable. Thus, in the end, the scales are levush, vestments. And in other words, the fish is kosher. And regarding the stringency that our master Nachmanides conceived, if anyone else had said it, I would have opposed it. I would have just said lenient across the board. It's okay across the board. But what can I do? Nachmanides said it. In other words, he doesn't want to oppose Nachmanides, but listen to his conclusion. In any case, I find that peeling by any means, in other words, the Talmudic standard, denotes scales, and the fish you sent to me is kosher without any doubt. So now, let's be clear. Landau did not eat sturgeon, but he was fine with everyone else eating it. Because in his mind, a lenient rule on sturgeon in this case is perfectly acceptable and authentic. So at this point, there's no conflict yet. If this was a movie, we're about a third or halfway through, the problem seems to have been resolved. This is the point in the movie where, the picture fades and across the screen, you see the words 15 years later. 15 years later, this is in the late 1790s, Landau has died. The controversy brews up again. Same Jews, Temeshvar, and in a couple of other communities as well. They begin to ask their rabbi, is sturgeon kosher or not? Now, this case, they couldn't refer the matter to Landau. He was gone. So they referred it to one of his students. In fact, one of his prize students, a rabbi whose name was Aaron Horan of Arad. Arad is a Jewish community in Transylvania. This is one of Landau's favorite students with a real reputation. And, well, I'll give you a little twist here. The thing about Horan is competent scholar, reputable, but he had already begun to introduce certain innovations in his congregation. Now, he had a very strict rule, Horan. He said, no innovations are possible unless they can be justified halachically in terms of existing legal precedent. But he also believed that anything that can be justified halachically is subject to change. That was his outlook, okay? So they sent him to this question, and he published his answer in a text called Imre Noam in 1798. This is text number 4, and this is what he writes. So he really ultimately, he comes up with several justifications. So in text number 4, he says, in answer to this query about Sturgeon, it has been 15 years since the precious light emanated from the Noda B'Yehuda, the great pious sage Ezekiel Landau of Prague, to permit the fish called sturgeon, which indeed would have scales and are permitted to be eaten without concern. And since then, not one great sage has criticized the instruction of the Noda B'Yehuda. And while a few of the rabbis in the district of Temeshvar ruled stringently, they neither knew nor understood the reason. In any case, the permission was disseminated in Temeshvar and here in Arad, and every great sage in the region had the customs of permitting the sturgeon. In other words, the reason it's kosher, I may not be Landau, but I still have the ruling of Landau. Landau said it's kosher. We follow the authority of that ruling. Okay. Now, his rival here was a rabbi from Paks, which is another city in Hungary, whose name was Isaac Kriegshaber, who also was a student of Landau, and he disagreed with that ruling. Now, Kriegshaber had a very different approach. He didn't believe, he was someone who preferred stringency in every case. He was someone who did believe that stringent is necessarily better, and he disagreed with the ruling of Aaron Horan. So here's the letter he wrote. This was a letter he wrote back to Horan, but it was in the form of a public letter. This is text number 6. Okay. Quote, I have heard that the Honorable Rabbi of Arad, meaning Aaron Horan, has permitted members of his community to eat the fish that until now has been regarded as an unkosher fish. We don't think sturgeon is kosher. And not only that, but that of his honor, affirmed injunction by acquiring for himself 3 liters of the said fish and bringing them into his home. Not only do you say it's kosher, he eats sturgeon himself, thereby demonstrating that his ruling was not only theoretical, but halakha l'maaseh, practical as well. 13 years ago, Kriegshaber goes on, my congregants began asking me to permit them to eat the little fish called sturgeon, saying that the departed rabbi of Temeshvar permitted it with the sanction of the great Rabbi Ezekiel Landau of Prague. And I have searched for any sort of justification for this ruling, but I could not find any scales. So I wrote to Landau himself, who answered me that sturgeon are classified as shratzim, unkosher fish, and anyone who eats them will be denied feasting on the great Leviathan, meaning you'll be denied entry into the world to come. You are sinful. Some of my more pious congregants cried out to me, how can it be that a rabbi, Horan, permits that which has been forbidden, while members of my community who are not so pious and immerse themselves in leniencies cried out to me, in what way are we different from the Jewish community of Arad? If they can eat it, why can't we? And are harassing me to permit them to eat unkosher meat. Okay, both sides have asked me to stir the hearts of the sages so that there will not be 2 conflicting rulings. But since I would rather not bother the great sages of the generation and to besmirch a man as famous as you, Horan, without knowing the reason, in any case, since the sages of our time do not have the authority to permit that which was previously forbidden, I ask that you retract your ruling and acknowledge that the fish is not kosher. Now, this is interesting. First of all, we have Kriegshaber saying, I guess we might place this in the category of alternative facts, because Horan has the ruling of Landau, says the fish is kosher. Kriegshaber said, not only didn't he say that, there's no way he could have said that. So what does Horan do in response? He writes to the Jewish community of Temeshvar and says, by any chance, do you have a copy of that letter you got from Landau? And the Jews of Temeshvar said, of course, it's important. They send it to Landau. He sends it to Kriegshaber. The letter, the words of Landau are right there. And still, Kriegshaber will not relent. And his ruling is not, he's not only not buying that Landau said it. His basic approach is he couldn't have said it. There's no way such leniency is permitted. So let's pause for a moment. We've got a kind of divergence of beliefs here. Horan issued a lenient ruling, and leniency, as we noted, is part of the long corpus of Jewish halachic rulings. Kriegshaber says, no, leniency is not acceptable. Now, Kriegshaber is going to go on to say, not only is leniency not an acceptable option here, it's not acceptable, period. In Kriegshaber, we begin to see the emergence of a mentality called Chumra culture, a culture of stringency. Stricter is necessarily better. We are still living in the aftermath of that culture. There are communities everywhere which think that stricter is necessarily better. Horan didn't. And here's where the conflict really begins. But Horan wasn't done. Horan came up with two additional justifications for Sturgeon being kosher, apart from the obvious one that Landau said so, which by any stretch, by any measure, should have been enough. Look at text number 7. Here he's going to make, this is what he says in text number 7. But we who live in Temeshvar and Arad heard of this incident from the inquirer himself and know that this permission has already been disseminated to many communities, and these are Hungarian Jewish communities, Miskolc and Gödöllő and Abaúj, and many other places that followed this heter, meaning this permission, until the claim arose that the sage of Prague, in fact, retracted his ruling. In other words, since the ruling of the Noda B'Yehuda, there are many Jewish communities following that, which means there are many Jews who are eating sturgeon as though it's kosher. And if you, Kriegshaber, are now going to say that sturgeon is not kosher, you're going to turn all of these Jews into treif-eating Jews. Now that really runs contrary to two elements of this pre-denominational Judaism. First of all, diversity of practice. And secondly, the notion of a mimetic approach. The approach of these Jewish communities is that sturgeon is okay, and it's halachically grounded in the ruling of Yechezkel Landau. But Kriegshaber is now saying, I don't care who eats it. I'm making a blanket decision that it's not kosher. And Horan, if you are going to say that it's kosher, you are going to be in trouble. And he did get in trouble, okay? Horan has one more justification. Look at text number 8. So he wrote a book. He wrote a text called Imre No, I'm arguing it. Kriegshaber wrote one back, and then Horan answered in another text called Shiryon Kaskasim. Now here, Kaskasim it means a coat of scales, but it can also mean a coat of armor, as if he's protecting his ruling. So this is text number 8. Indeed, in 1789. I ruled regarding the scales of these fish, whether or not the scales penetrate the skin. Nonetheless, even though a tribunal lacks the authority to reveal that this instruction contradicts the ruling of the rabbis from whose casks we drink, I would have been allowed to rule stringently by myself, but not to contradict and interdict in a place where there is an extant ruling of a teacher. In other words, even if I didn't have Landau's letter, I'm allowed to issue a more stringent ruling, but he's also allowed to issue a more lenient ruling. He goes on to say, just as the Ramah. Now, the Ramah is Moses Israelis. This is the editor of the Ashkenazic adaptation of the Shulchan Aruch, big-time scholar. The Ramah agreed with the conclusion of Rabbeinu Asher, a medieval Spanish scholar, that, quote, and this is basically Horan quoting a rabbi from 700 years before, if there is a leniency already in place, and even more, if it has been applied and implemented, a rabbinic colleague may not forbid based on a stronger opinion. Even if I didn't have Landau fortifying my position, once a leniency becomes what we would call established law, someone who thinks it should be stricter can't just pop in and impose a stringency. That's not the way it works. And what Horan is talking about, leniency and stringency, have been part of our tradition for a long time. So he's turning it around. He says, Kriegshaber, you might think that just because you're stricter, you're more authentic or you're right. The opposite is true, according to the Ramah and according to Rabbeinu Asher. Imposing a stringency, a chumrah, on a community that's been used to doing it their own way is just as wrong as imposing a leniency on communities that have been strict. The custom of the community has to prevail. And one of the reasons is a common observance helps maintain the unity of that community. So Kriegshaber in this exchange couldn't win. So what he does is he starts to look around for rabbis to help him to help him really bring Horan to justice, to the Beit Din. He's able to find a couple. He finds a rabbi named Moshe Munz, who's the rabbi of Pesht, Mordechai Bennett from Nikolsburg. Now, these rabbis joined in the condemnation of Horan not because of the Sturgeon necessarily. They had a little bit of a personal problem with him. They didn't like his other changes. This was a little bit political. In 1803, Horan was summoned to the Beit Din in Pest, and they threatened to excommunicate him and shave his beard, which is part of the punishment, if he didn't retract his lenient ruling on Sturgeon, and he relented for the moment. He relented. They let him alone. He went back to his community in Arad. He said, you know what? In Arad, we're going to keep eating the Sturgeon. And that essentially is the end of the story. The conflict over the Sturgeon really boiled up. I mean, there was a point in 1803 where Kriegshaber started this letter writing campaign to get as many rabbis as possible to condemn Horan, and Horan began a letter writing campaign to find rabbis to support him. This was a dangerous moment. If Horan had dug in his heels, it really might have split the Jewish world, at least the Jewish world in Hungary and in Romania and maybe in Poland and other parts of Central Europe. Horan relented. He relented because this notion of unity was important to him. But maybe he also realized that once he was back in the safety of his own community, which was quite a distance away from these other rabbis, maybe he could go back to doing what he was doing, which is exactly what he did. Now, that was 1803. 15 years later, here's how we'll conclude this thing. 15 years later, that Sturgeon controversy was overshadowed by a more dramatic controversy, which began in Germany over a new movement called Reform Judaism, which elicited a similar kind of response that Kriegshaber had against the Sturgeon. Kriegshaber said, this leniency cannot exist because it's simply unacceptable, no matter what halachic justifications you have. In the response to this first Reform congregation in 1818, the leader of the opposition, Moses Sofer, who was the rabbi of Pressburg, which is today Bratislava, he made a blanket statement, which in many ways was codifying what Kriegshaber said, which was kol davar chadash asur me'at Torah. Anything that is new is forbidden by the Torah. So what we have emanating out of this Sturgeon controversy are 2 points of view. One, we have this view that nothing can change, stricter is better. These are pillars of what today is an Orthodox mentality. But we also have a mentality which says, and this is Horan's mentality, you might think you're more pious, but what I'm doing is more consistent with what Judaism has been doing for the last several hundred years, or 1,500 years, since the time of the Talmud. Horan had a notion that although he was lenient, although he made changes, although he followed a more mimetic approach, his was the more authentic, not this emerging mentality which crystallized as orthodoxy. So let me conclude by asking the question, what about today? Is Sturgeon kosher or not? And look at the answer. Look at text number 9. Okay, this is from an interview with the grandson of the guy who founded Barney Greengrass, Gary Greengrass. Okay, quote: "It's a tough question. It's a shayla, a tough question, shayla," expounded Gary Greengrass, who was not a rabbi, but the hereditary heir of the Sturgeon king Barney Greengrass and owner of the hugely popular 95-year-old Upper West Side smoked fish shop that bears his grandfather's name. The week leading up to Yom Kippur is Greengrass's busiest. In just a couple days, the store sells hundreds and hundreds of pounds of sturgeon at $48 a pound in 2003, and ships it across the country from the deep south to the Pacific Northwest. It's funny, I was just talking to a customer, Greengrass told me, and he said an Orthodox rabbi was ruling that swordfish and sturgeon are kosher because under a microscope they can see scales, which of course is the Talmud standard, but not Nachmanides standard. Okay, a few blocks away at Murray's Sturgeon, that's one of the ones you mentioned, another Upper West Side institution, proprietor Ira Galler agreed there is little agreement. This has been an argument for eons and eons, and it comes up all the time. The point being is that the resolution of the Sturgeon controversy is agree to disagree. If you eat it, fine. If you don't eat it, also fine. In other words, in an earlier age, this would have been the disagreement over kitniot, over legumes on Pesach. Some do, some don't, no problem. So I suppose the question we should ask, and the question I'll end with is, why was that debate or disagreement over kitniyot really without issue, without conflict, but the sturgeon elicited so much more? And I would suggest a couple of reasons. First of all, kitniyot, the difference of kitniyot, the different opinions of kitniyot were separated by great distances. And in the Middle Ages, travel was difficult, communication was limited. Oftentimes, Jews in one part of the world didn't really know what Jews in another part of the world were doing. So oftentimes, Ashkenazic and Sephardic Jews, for example, didn't know what the other was doing. And by the time each discovered the custom of the other on kitniyot, it had been a long-established custom. Secondly, in that pre-denominational Judaism, diversity of practice was baked in. It was hardwired. A disagreement over kitniyot simply wasn't that big a deal. Finally, in the case of Kriegshaber, he's having a little bit of a panic here because he doesn't trust Horan, and we might say that Horan seemed too modern to him. What we have, and part of the motivation for this mentality of stringency and refusal to countenance change, is a fear that in the modern world, things might change too fast, and we need more of a defensive, dig in your heels, siege mentality, which really hadn't existed before. So that's the gist of the Sturgeon controversy, and that's the Sturgeon controversy, how it differs from kitniyot, and that's why the Sturgeon controversy is the great example of Jews agreeing to disagree. Toda rabah. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you. Very interesting and relevant. People are talking about in the chat about contemporary issues we're seeing play out in the Supreme Court and in our society, about society moving in response to progressive ideology. There's a certain segment of our society in America that's moved way more conservative, and now we see this clash going on, just playing out in our Supreme Court with women's rights and other rights that were given and now are being taken. So we're seeing it in a different perspective. So a few questions for you. First question, how much sturgeon was actually eaten in that part of the world? Was it really that big an issue? Was it like, a big staple food?
That's a great question. The short answer is I don't know. I don't think anybody knows quantity, but it wasn't so much the quantity. It was more that for those who ate sturgeon, it was a delicacy that dafka had to be eaten. It really was a core part of certain holiday observances, for Shabbat observances. It was not so much that they ate a ton of it and that not having would be some kind of, nutritional problem. It was more that the custom of eating sturgeon was like the custom of having latkes on Hanukkah. It just wouldn't seem complete or authentic for some Jews without having the sturgeon. So it wasn't so much the how much, it was how it was sort of hardwired into the Jewish calendar, the culinary calendar of the Jewish people.
As you mentioned, we have the same issue with swordfish. So my family from South Africa via Lithuania eats swordfish, but many families don't. So A, can you go over the issue of why there's an issue with swordfish? Is it the same exact issue, I assume, or maybe different? And then did that become as big an issue or not?
Great question. If I had another half an hour, I could use swordfish as well. So as far as I know, and I'm going to admit, I'm not a maven here. As far as my understanding, the problem with swordfishes is not exactly peelability, but the scales are there when the swordfish is a baby, but somehow they disappear. So the fully grown fish doesn't have scales. So the full-grown fish, I think that's the issue with swordfish and maybe sunfish as well. Now, as far as a dispute into the 20th century, most rabbinic decisors were fine with swordfish. In the 1930s, there wasn't much dispute. In fact, the leading proponent of eating swordfish was a rabbi, one of the leading scholars, in the world of Jewish scholarship, Louis Ginsburg at the Jewish Theological Seminary, who was a towering presence, who ate swordfish and said it was fine. It's only subsequently where there were those who tended to those who had the mentality of being stricter said, just to be sure, we better not eat swordfish. So there was this reluctance to take a chance. But, it never rose to the level of the sturgeon controversy, although today there are those who will say that if you eat swordfish, even though it's your family custom, even though there's a perfectly legitimate halachic justification for eating it, that they believe it's not kosher simply because it's not kosher, because everyone should follow that stricter approach. I think that's the difference. So the factor, the issue with Storvitch is a little different, but the larger issue is very much the same, and the timing and the milieu is very similar to Sturgeon.
As an aside, we had a speaker on, Rabbi Rachel Isaacs from Waterville, Maine, just a few weeks ago. So she's the rabbi up there talking about the history and the community there. She must have arrived after you, but you know,
I've heard great things about her. I wish I had been there when she was there. I've heard she's really brought that community back to life.
Going back to our fish story. So New York and Barney Greengrass and people, and how big was Sturgeon in, I mean, this may be a question you don't know the answer to, but was Sturgeon a big fish in New York? Did it become this big delicacy in the Jewish world?
Yeah. Remember, in New York, you have so many Jews, which means you have a large constituency that follows every point of view. So even if, let's say the numbers of New York Jews who ate sturgeon at Barney Greengrass were like the poll you took, maybe 20%. 20% of New York Jews eating sturgeon and 20% of New York Jews wanting to have sturgeon or insisting to have sturgeon, for example, during the breakfast, that's a lot of sturgeon and a huge demand for sturgeon. So in sheer numbers, I don't know. But even if it was a small percentage of New York Jews, and I think it was more than that, there still is a consistent demand. That's the beauty of, if you're a purveyor of Jewish anything in New York, you always have a ready-made constituency.
There have been a few questions about the term mimetic. Okay. One reference saying, I'm wondering if that term is an old term, or was that from Chaim Soloveitchik? Where's the term from? And can you just explain that a little bit further?
Of course, thank you. Yes, it's from Chaim Soloveitchik. Chaim Soloveitchik, who is the son of Rabbi Joseph Soloveitchik, sort of the dean of modern Orthodoxy in America. Chaim Soloveitchik is his son, is also a historian. He wrote an article in 1994 called Rupture and Reconstruction, where he explained that the way observant Jews observed for centuries, really prior to the 20th century, was more mimetic. Now, he also based this notion of mimetic on similar findings by an Israeli sociologist named Menachem Friedman. Menachem Friedman used different terminology. Menachem Friedman's term for mimetic, what Soloveitchik called mimetic, was life tradition. You figure out what to do based on the experiences of your life and your family and your community, as opposed to book tradition, which means if you're looking for an answer, you look in law codes. Now, it was Menachem, both Friedman and Soloveitchik, what they determined is, as I said, mimetic/life tradition was the guiding principle, the guiding way of being an observant Jew in the shtetl and other parts of the old world. And one of the things that happened in the 20th century for a number of reasons is there was a shift away from mimetic life tradition toward book tradition. And the shift happened particularly in two places. First of all, in the yeshivas of Lithuania, most of the great yeshivas, the Litvak yeshivas, you had students who not only studied there, but also lived there. So they were away from their families, and they didn't have the context for a mimetic life tradition approach because they didn't have their families around. They tended to figure out right and wrong, permitted and permissive and forbidden based on law codes. They were book tradition Jews. The other place is in the 20th century. One of the tragic impacts of the Shoah and that destruction of Eastern European Jewish civilization was a destruction of that world in which mimetic life tradition Judaism really held sway, was the predominant form of Judaism. In the aftermath of the Shoah, in an attempt to rebuild, this is when book tradition, when not mimetic, when law codes and rulings and beit dins, this is when it became more prevalent for the first time.
The term mimetic, is it from mime, as in?
Yeah. Mime, yes, you're imitating that which you saw your parents do, or in my case, I'm imitating what I saw my mom do. That's how Jews figured it out. An interesting aspect of mimetic Judaism is that when it came to figuring out, the kosher kitchen was the domain of the mom, of the mother, of the woman, not the father. And Chaim Soloveitchik himself said that he and his father, in their kitchen, neither of them decided what was kosher or not. His mother decided. And she decided mimetically based on what she had learned from her mother. This was a pervasive form of figuring out right and wrong in many instances, in many places, in many aspects of Judaism. And it was a very positive and constructive one because it naturally allowed for fluidity and diversity alongside this larger uniformity. A nice, healthy.
Right. I will add, given my koshering of my kitchen, it is the same thing. Different families have different levels of how they kosher their kitchen for Pesach. Some wrap everything in foil, some do that. It's all, but it's very different. Some just clean off their counters and some have to put stuff on their counters and do all different things. And I have found that really you have to ask your mom what she did to figure out what you should do. So it's very similar.
And all these different ways are perfectly authentic. The mimetic source, but also the fact that both lenient and stringent are acceptable options.
So going back to the fundamental debate, was there something in the society at that time that drove the more conservative, with a small c, rabbi to push for the chumrah? In other words, was there something in the air that he felt challenged by, that he felt he needed to push back on this flexible Judaism, this Judaism that had a balance of stringency and leniency?
Great question. It's a great question. This is really a subject of an entirely different lecture, the origins of Orthodoxy. But I'll see if I can give you a 60-second answer, or maybe a 90-second answer. There was an internal stimulus and an external stimulus. The external stimulus is this is the point when the mainstream society is becoming more open to Jews. This is the point when, for example, in Hungary, the Emperor of Austria is beginning to remove restrictions on where Jews can live, what they can do. And this is the beginnings of the discussion of maybe Jews becoming equal citizens and having access to mainstream society. And for someone like Kriegshaber, there's a fear that that's going to allow Jews to leave the Jewish community. That's the external one. Internally, we also have Jews within the Jewish community who are beginning to rethink, or at least reinterpret, what it means to be Jewish. Foremost among them was a Jew in Berlin named Moses Mendelssohn. And Mendelssohn began to advocate, for example, secular education in Jewish schools. And the changes he was suggesting also were frightening and unnerving to someone like Kriegshaber. Now, all of this is before the emergence of Reform Judaism, which is the first redefinition of Judaism. When that happens, these earlier preliminary concerns are magnified and intensified. So if the Sturgeon debate had happened after the rise of Reform Judaism, we would have seen excommunications and a much more intense battle. But instead, it's kind of a preliminary or preparatory moment for that broader, more dramatic dispute between reformers and what becomes orthodoxy. Now, I should also be very clear, is that Horan, he disagreed with the hyper-stringency of someone like Kriegshaber, but 20 years later, he was not a Reform Jew either. Horan believed things can change, but for Reform Jews, and this is also a subject of another talk, for Reform Jews, the rationale of change was not halachic precedent. The rationale of change was zeitgeist, the spirit of the age, which Horan would not accept. So he accepted some of the changes themselves that Reform Jews made, like changes in the liturgy, but he rejected their non-halachic rationale, which really left him in the sweet spot of where Judaism had been for many, many years.
Well, thank you so much. I hope everybody, when you go to synagogue in the next few days, the last in Israel day, out of Israel 2 days of Yontif, and you're in line at your Kiddush, and you look down and you see your fish, it probably won't be a sturgeon, but you'll think about this lecture and you'll share something with the person standing next to you about CSP and the program. So thank you so much, Professor Lupovitch. Thank you, everybody. What a terrific program and a great way to go into the end of the holiday. I wish you all a happy and healthy end of the Chag. Enjoy time with your family. Enjoy the matzah, because you don't have to eat it for a whole nother year. So this is the time to enjoy it. Okay. Take care. Be safe, everybody.
Everyone.